Hi, this is Paul. Synod 2025. This is Synod of the Christian Reformed Church that some of you have followed. Oh, my shirt matches the Synod blue. How about that? I'll have to wear. I have a lot of these blue shirts, as those of you who watch the channel know, because when I find something, I buy a lot of them. So I'll have to bring a lot of them to Redeemer University in Ontario, where Synod is meeting. Now, we had our convening session last night, May 28, and it is on YouTube, and I'll put the link below if you're curious about it and want to watch. I'll do some talking about this, and I'll talk something about, I am a delegate this year, as I just said, and I can talk about some of these things. I can make videos before, and I can make videos after, but I can't do social media during. So, because I'm a delegate, the channel's going to be pretty quiet and silent that week, so you'll just have to watch Synod and look for me out there on the floor. I don't know how gripping it will be this year, but let's jump into it. So the convening church is this guy. We have devotions. This fella here, Nate Vander, who's going to be my roommate at Synod. He's also one of the three moderators at CRC Voices, and his church is convening Synod. It basically meant that he has to open some things. You needed a church sort of convening the Synod. Now, I made some jokes on CRC Voices about the fact that when he first came on, I thought, is he doing this in his bathroom? It sure looks like a shower stall behind him. And then I thought, boy, he's super Christian Reformed, because he's even got the CRC logo etched into his shower stall. But he's probably doing it at the Burlington offices of the Christian Reformed Church. I suppose they have that etched glass there in Burlington. So if you want to see Nate in action, you can find Nate's been in some of our live streams. If you want to see Nate in action, you can find him there. And mostly what we do in this session is it's always sort of amazing when I see that, despite the pandemic, there's a good number of people who haven't done a lot on Zoom, and so everybody gets a chance. You have roll call. We learn how to do the voting. It's a 2.5-hour meeting, which for me, starting at 4 p.m. on the West Coast, isn't so terrible. And then the main thing that has to be done at this meeting is the election of officers for Synod. Now, Synod officers don't have a tremendous amount of power in terms of deciding the way things go. Most of their job is to run the meeting. But you can learn something by seeing who gets elected to office. And if you've been following Synod over the last several number of years on this channel, you'll notice the arrival of the Abide Project. The Abide Project is a group. Let's go to their website, About Abide. Let's go to the top. The Abide Project, for the sake of the true gospel, the faithfulness of Christ Church, the glory of God, and the good of his people, we strive for the Christian Reformed Church to uphold the beautiful biblical, confessional, and historical understanding of human sexuality and doctrine, discipline, discipleship, and discipline. So the Abide Project was basically forged to keep the Christian Reformed Church from following mainline churches into affirming same-sex marriage and some of those things. And the Abide Project has succeeded. There's been some talk about when I had Aaron Vriesman on the channel from the Abide Project a few years ago. I asked him, he's the clerk right now of North Blendon CRC in Hudsonville. I asked him, well, when are you guys going to quit? And what was interesting is that he told me, he said, well, basically, this is our one mission, and then we're going to go away. And they haven't gone away. Now, I've been told that Zach King, the director of the denomination, asked them to sort of stay on and keep going for a little while. I don't quite know why, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens to this organization. This isn't an unusual thing in the Christian Reformed Church, especially when there are conflicts. For example, I was in college and seminary during the heat of the women in church office wars in the Christian Reformed Church. And while the Banner is the official publication of the Christian Reformed Church, owned by the Christian Reformed Church, at that point there were other papers and magazines. There was no internet then. Yes, I outdate the internet. Maybe the big white beard gives it away. But people would have, there was Christian Renewal was one of those publications. And these were publications that were conservative, trying to keep the Christian Reformed Church from doing certain things. Now, in terms of Women in Church Office, the Women in Church Office won, and eventually there's the local option in the Christian Reformed churches, that local churches can have women, deacons, elders, and ministers if they so choose. Once a majority of churches in a particular classis allowed women in church office, then the classis would allow women in church office, generally speaking. And then when a majority of classes in the Christian Reformed Church allowed women in church office, then Synod allowed women in church office. And I was at the first Synod where there were women seated at Synod. And that local option has been sort of a nervous truce for a while. And of course, I have a playlist of videos that touch on the Christian Reformed Church, and you can go back and see me treat many of these issues and a lot of the history of the Christian Reformed Church through the lens of a lot of these issues. So I'm not going to go back over all that in terms of the circulatory system and all those types of comments, but they will come up in this video. So Abide has been an interesting group in that they basically were a coalition that came together to make sure exactly what their mission statement said. That the Christian Reformed Church sort of bucked the trend, and, well, actually I heard it in a recent video. It was right there in the teaser for the Gavin Ortland Redeemed Zoomer face-off. I haven't watched this video yet, but a clip appeared on Twitter that is definitely going to have me watch this video, because the issues that they talk about, I'm interested in those issues. And in some ways, I might be sort of between them. I'm more progressive than Gavin. And Redeemed Zoomer's sort of hard to pin down. And of course, these things aren't linear. But the first thing that Redeemed Zoomer opens with,
question to you would be, why is almost every modern church split the conservatives leaving and not the liberals leaving? I've never been stoned to death for
and the reality of the Christian Reformed Church is that we went the other way. The liberals are being sent packing from the Christian Reformed Church. They are being exiled as we speak. And a number of churches are now disaffiliating with the denomination. And the conservatives are very much in charge. But see, part of the difficulty is that when you say conservatives, there's this first filter dynamic out there in the world that however you identify, if you identify as a conservative or a liberal or a progressive, sort of regardless of how that actually plays out, you would say conservatives leaving, yay, or conservatives winning, yay. Sort of that's your first filter based on these words, and those words might not mean exactly what you think they mean. So in the Christian Reformed Church, Abide succeeded in its mission, but I was, part of the reason I asked Aaron about that was I was very interested. Will they, in fact, unlike the March of Dimes and just about every other interest group that forms, will they give up on this thing that they've created, this body that they've created, when the mission is done? And I think for the most part in the Christian Reformed Church, the mission is done. Or will they have ongoing movement, energy, and creep? So first we did same-sex marriage. Next will be women in office. I mean, we'll talk about that. So like I said, I knew I was a delegate to Synod 2022 as well. And when we, again over Zoom, elected officers for that Synod, I knew right then pretty much the way everything at Synod would go. Because if you think about the election of officers and what that means, it's hard to sort of put it down into words. it tells you something about the body. And if you ask 180 people or 160 people, 160, 170 people, who of your group, and there's usually a list of 12 to 15 people who say they would be willing to serve. That's where you start. Everyone at Synod is asked, would you be willing to serve in these roles? And just check yes or no. And so most of us who've been around long enough, because many people at Synod don't have a lot of synodical experience, because many of them are deacons and elders. Many of the ministers have a lot more synodical experiences, because we tend to go often. And you need those people with a lot of synodical experience to sort of help the Synod work, because nobody is born just knowing how to do Synod in the Christian Reformed Church. So there's a lot of dependency on institutional memory. So those of us who've been a number of times very much should check, yes, I'm willing to serve, yes, I'm willing to serve. So then you have these elections, and what's interesting is that you have these elections and you have a good list of names, and usually if you've got 170 people voting, they put down some biographies of some of the people, then you'll get a distribution of, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sort of close votes at the top and then trailing off. Ever since 2022, we have had a real when you get the number of votes, you see immediately one person has, in this case, a fifth of the votes already. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. Oh, let's just talk about the history of, well, maybe, how should I do this? Should I talk about this post that I wrote on Voices? Maybe I'll start there. Now, because I have a high profile, because I have blogged for a number of years in the Christian Reformed Church, and because I do talk about the CRC on this channel, that gives me an advantage, because generally speaking, the people who get votes are ones who are well known and at least to a degree liked. And so in that way, the executive thing is sort of like a beauty contest. And we'll talk names in a little bit. I know some of you people are CRC people, and you're watching this because you want to know what I'm going to say. So Synod had its first meeting last night. In case you and Andy Littleton, now Andy has been on the channel. Andy is from Classis, Arizona. Andy is a good friend of my very good friend, Rod Hugan, who is also going to Synod. So Andy was doing the Zoom meeting from his car, and those of us in the corner who do StreamYard and things like that from the car, I just laughed because it was like, hey, Andy, you're coming to this meeting? What meeting? The Synod convening meeting. Oh, I forgot. I'm on my way home. So he gets onto it on his cell phone, and he's got to do it. It was funny to watch. It was funny to watch. Anyway, so Andy, I love you. You've been on the channel. I feel free poking at you. And I look forward to seeing you at Synod, my friend. In case you and Andy Littleton almost missed it, and the most interesting thing about it, what has been the most interesting thing about all such executive elections since 2022. Now, I have to talk about myself because I had these observations and I was going to write them on Voices, and I knew people would be like, oh, sour grapes, you just wanted to be president and you didn't get elected. So let's just come clean. And MJ, if you're watching, pay special attention to this part of the video because it's for you. Even though you can't answer in the comments. You can go ahead and answer on Luke and Sam's thing. Now, I didn't want to write this because it is too easy to imagine that this is PVK didn't get elected, so this is sour grapes. And I certainly hope it isn't. Yeah, I have sufficient narcissism and vanity in me where winning the beauty contest would feed my ego. But I also want sufficient freedom at Synod to hobnob and hang out with Rod and Nate and make droll, cynical comments for my own base amusement. Two carnalities war within me. My mother prays fervently whenever I go to Synod that I not be elected, not because she doesn't think I'll do a good job, but because she knows how people are. She's a minister's wife, of course. She knows how church politics go. And she wouldn't want to hear or imagine people saying bad things about her beloved son. So Mom does lurk. She lurks on the channel. She lurks on CRC Voices. So Mom's prayers were answered, which I told her last night. I said, Mom, your prayers were answered. I am not in the executive team. As has been true since 2022, the first round of votes reveals a clear consensus as to who would be king of the prom. Now, the exec in our system doesn't really have a lot of power to change the course of things, but it does signal something about how the body is working. And again, there is sort of a beauty contest, vanity contest. It's always a nice thing to feel the approval of your peers and to be pushed up the hierarchy. But at the same time, most synod jobs are way more worth than the vanity is worth. Are way more work than the vanity is worth. And so, again, to the execs this year, again, I applaud you and I support you, because part of me really wouldn't want to be you, because I know it's just work. It's a lot. Synod is a sprint. And it is a lot of hours, and you miss a lot of sleep, and it is super intense. And if you're an introvert, it's really hard on you, because it is people, and it is reading, and decision, and it's sort of like war in that you have long periods of monotony, and then suddenly you have to decide, and it's a week, and so it's intense. Synod will wear you out. And if you have additional duties besides, it's a lot. Plus the fact that when I go to Synod, what I really enjoy is hanging out with former classmates, friends I only see now and then at church things, sitting and having meals, talking about ideas. Those of you who know me through my channel have a pretty good idea about why I enjoy going to Synod. It is fun hanging out with these people, and I like the excitement, I like the energy, I like the conviviality, I like the whole thing. It's awesome, but it's a ton of work. And if you're on the executive, it's way more work and actually less fun. So again, I salute you all. Try to be open about this. Before the vibe shift, and it's not just the CRC vibe shift, it's the cultural vibe shift. It's the vibe shift that's been going through our culture all the way up to the President of the United States and all the way down to the homeless people in the streets. Before the vibe shift, the standard makeup for the executive was to pick someone as chair who wouldn't screw up. Because if you have an incompetent chair of Synod, Synod is miserable. So you really don't want that. So one of the things that people always look for in terms of an executive is someone who has been to Synod a number of times, someone especially who has been an executive at previous synods, someone who has chaired classes often, has been involved in denominational things. And so, well, let's look through. I had Gemini make me a list, and I was really impressed that it could make this list. I had to sort of tell it where to look, but it did, and it did a pretty good job. So let's look at synods before COVID, shall we? Now, when I look at synods before COVID, I look at who, let's say, historically and traditionally have been synod presidents during my lifetime since I've been able to watch synod. Synod presidents usually are pastors of larger churches who have demonstrated themselves in their local church, in their classis, in denominational boards, and are known more or less throughout the classis for one thing or another. And so when I look at, after it made this list, it started fighting me on some things. So it was like, okay, I'm not going to fight you anymore, AI. Scott Greenway on this list has been president of Synod in 2014 and 2018. Now, Scott, like me, is a third-generation Christian Reformed minister. His father taught at Calvin Seminary and at Westminster East. His grandfather was a high-profile CRC minister. Scott is a minister of a large... I really have to get Scott on the channel. Scott is a fun guy. I went to college and seminary with Scott, and I had to make sure to not sit near Scott during my classes at seminary, because the kinds of fun I can enjoy during the monotony at Synod, weren't really what I should enjoy during the active attention required at seminary, because Scott has a great sense of humor, and Scott has all the gifts to be a successful minister in the Christian Reformed Church. He's got pedigree, he's got talent, he's got smarts, and so Scott, not a surprise to be chair of Synod a couple of times, and he's in West Michigan. Paul DeVries, another former classmate of mine, and similar things about Paul DeVries. Paul DeVries and Scott are good friends. Paul DeVries has pastored in New Jersey. Paul DeVries' father pastored the church. I'm sure he inhabited the office that I'm sitting in. I live in the house that Paul DeVries grew up in. Some of you remember Paul DeVries from Synod 2023. So Paul DeVries also twice on that list. And Paul, all those things I said about Scott, also, many of those things also true of Paul. He's a minister's son. He's got a great personality. He's sharp. He's been very successful as a large CRC minister, pastors one of the important churches in the Grand Rapids area. And so, again, Scott, Paul, Corpool, 2017. Corpool, another friend of mine, pastor from Southern California, was stated clerk in California South for many years. I first met him on the Christian Reformed Home Missions Board. He used to sit next to him. Again, you get to have a certain cadre of people that, unfortunately, Cor died a few years ago unexpectedly. Bruce Personaire, another friend of mine from my classis. And in fact, at my last classis meeting, Bruce said, "You're going to be president of this synod," because basically the career that I've had, except for my small church experience, but my denominational experience really before once the channel started in 2017, 2018, I sort of dropped out of a lot of classical and denominational stuff because I was just too busy doing this channel. So Bruce Personaire, who was chair of classis of Synod 2015. I was at that classis, did a great job. Bruce serves with me at a variety of classical things. And again, all of these guys, William Koopmans, guy's been very active in CRC ecumenical activities, very skilled guy, very active, very well known. All of these guys were very much who you expect. So let me talk about, I'll go back to it because I run through some of this in the document. The chair is usually a good mixture of pragmatism and beauty contest, because picking someone who really doesn't run the meeting well would cause a week of serious embarrassment and frustration. Now, I have a new acronym that I've developed, the Abide Millennial Males, because they are the new bosses. They are the new bosses of Synod. The AMMs, the Abide Millennial Males, are the new regime that has been competent at running the meetings, so that has been good. And the Abide Millennial Males have took over Synod 2024 and now 2025. So it's interesting because you can go to the banner. I'll put all my links below. The 2024 mix were, now pay attention here, because these two guys aren't at this synod. These two guys are. And if you look at this year's, and Abide already got a video up. I feel beat out now, man. Abide got their video up before me. Where's the 2025 dudes? There they are. So, and then if you look at, and I teased, let me show you the list here. I teased Ken Benjamins, even though I did vote for him. I voted for Ken Benjamins because he's not a millennial. I don't know how old Ken is. I suspect he's about my age, might be a little older. It's really hard to tell. I didn't go through seminary with him, but he's Canadian, so I thought it would be really nice. A bunch of these guys are Canadian, but Stephen Terpstra, he's not in Borculo anymore. They got to update that. He went to Iowa. Stephen Terpstra, who's president this year, is from Canada. But I thought it would be really nice, given that Synod is in Canada, to not only have someone with Canadian roots, but to have someone who is actively serving a Canadian church be president of Synod. And that's why I voted for Ken. Even though if you watch the video, you will see me making a comment about how Ken talked about the fact that he doesn't even have to stay in the dorm at Redeemer. He can sleep at home. And because I tell you, when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, sleeping in those shorter beds in the dorm, it was one thing. But, now that I'm in my 60s, dorms aren't, I actually don't mind at all. It's kind of fun. Where was I? Me running a meeting might be okay. I've run plenty of Classis meetings, and Classis knows how I do it. I'm not sure it would suit everyone's taste. I do have a bit of troll in me, as some of you know, which is why I want to hang out with Rod and Nate and Aaliyah making stupid quips to pass the time, while the verbal processors involuntarily burden the rest of us as they have to think out loud at the microphone on the floor of the plenary sessions. See, this is where I would probably... because I sometimes say things that aren't polite. My politeness number is a little low. And I might just call out certain people for their... because what happens is, when you go up to the mic, speak in favor of the motion, speak against the motion, move to amend, then you can't give a speech or just explain why you want to amend. And then, move to table. There's a certain number of things you should do when you go up to the mic. What tends to happen at Synod is people go up to mic and say, I don't know how I feel about this motion. And they process out loud. Now, I am not against processing out loud. That is what I am doing right now. That is what you have volunteered to listen to. But you can click away at any moment. And many of you do. Google tracks that. And if you have Google Analytics, like half of the people who clicked on this thing at the beginning are gone by now. They were only here for 30 seconds and they left. And the rest of you just sort of slowly go until I bore you sufficiently, and then you take off. The problem with Synod is we're all captive audiences, and I am a rather large man, and usually we are squished into small places, sort of shoulder to shoulder with people. We've got computers and things on our desk, and so there we sit for hours. And someone comes up to the mic and, I don't know how I feel about this, and I was just thinking this. And so previous synods now lately, they've put a clock up, and it was Kent Hendricks, who's also been on the channel. In his Substack, he noted that actually the clock is counterproductive, because when people see the clock, or even they think that the officers are watching the clock, they then think, well, I have 2 hours to fill. Not 2 hours, I'm sorry, 2 minutes or 3 minutes to fill. So then they actually talk longer than if there's no clock. So there's a lot of psychological tricks to this. And the difficulty is that there are some people who really do need to think out loud, and they can't just do it in their own heads. And so then when they have to make a decision, and they have to think out loud, and you're not allowed to talk if you're sitting in the chair. The only thing you can do is go up to the mic, and then we all have to sit and listen to you think out loud, which might be of some marginal benefit, but you're not really up there to think out loud. You're up there to say, I'm for the motion, I'm against the motion, or move to table, or one of these other things. Go up there with your idea, with your argument, and as the chair always says, if your argument's been made, don't go to the mic. But every Synod president has to sit there and this point's been made, this point's been made, this point's been made. But this is a church meeting, so we all got to be nice to each other, which means that you can't just sort of say, I've heard that point. And so I know I wrote this for Voices, and a whole bunch of people were like, please tell me the secret to avoid this. And I don't have a trick per se. Actually, I've thought of ideas before. Giving every Synod delegate like 5 chips, and every time you go to the mic, you have to spend a chip. Those verbal processors, they'd be in trouble. It's like verbally processed during the coffee break, bub, not into the mic. Save your or verbal process, type it on your computer and show it to your neighbor, or pass notes, or pull faces, or I usually take I have to decide what toys I'm going to take to Synod. I usually take toys with me. Why would you're a grown man, why take toys to Synod? Silly Putty is actually pretty good because you can do stuff with your hands, because I'm ADHD and I have to sit there. And I never could sit still in church, which is why I get to be a preacher. So I don't have to sit still in church anymore. Some smart psychologist, I could tell them that, Sunday afternoons were a frequent time where I would get spankings for my inability to sit in church. So I become a minister to punish the people in the queue, or in the pew. There, I said it, and that's probably a little snarkier version of the speech that I would give at Synod if I were president. So, the rest of the executive, but the rest of, the vice president, he gets, the president, depending on what he decides to do, the vice president gets to chair the meeting a little bit. And the other two guys, they're the clerks. And historically, the clerks would be responsible for keeping the minutes, calling roll call, counting the votes, et cetera, et cetera. But, clerks have sort of been outsourced to staff and automation. The voting is now done by computer. There's a fly that got in here. I hate it when a fly gets in. Because, there's got a whole church that the fly could wander in, but that lonely fly has to come in here and circle my head. Happens all the time. If I catch him, he dies. Anyway, back to the story. I got to keep my eye on the clock. So, where was I going with this? We were talking about the all right, we'll just keep reading. Oh, so the rest of the executive. So the clerks don't really have a lot to do anymore. And so they mostly, but the executive does have a lot of judgment calls to make. So their role is important because they will be making decisions as a group usually. And the CRC is a very team-oriented, group-oriented church. We don't like people making individual decisions. So the executive will work together, and they'll make groups together, and we'll weigh it. And so the clerks just sit up there on stage and kind of help support the president. And really the whole executive helps support the president, because all of Synod wants the president to do a good job, because if the president doesn't do a good job, we all suffer. And again, it's not a matter of getting things through or not getting things through. There's a lot of attention, paid a lot of attention to Paul de Vries sort of coming down from the chair and making that big speech at Synod 2023. That was a super unusual thing. That very seldom happens, that the president sort of comes down and gives a speech from the floor. In fact, it's discouraged. And the reason it's discouraged is because just by virtue of someone's performance during the meeting, you create sort of a relationship with the president that gives them a degree of credibility. Now, Paul already had that credibility because he's the kind of guy who could be elected as president of Synod. And so usually what happened with the executive teams of Synod over the last good number of years is they sort of filled out the diversity card. What do I mean by that? Generally speaking, in years past, and usually, again, before COVID, we just elected presidents when we got to Synod. Everybody's looking for experience and competence. And so that will tend to focus on a few visible people who have, who really have depth. Oh boy, I can see. Excuse. I make these videos because I think out loud. And Lloyd, who's been on the channel, commented on Voices. Yeah, you should cast stones at processing verbally out loud. It's like, yeah, but again, you can all click away from this, and you don't have to read my CRC Voices post. You don't have to do any of those things. But at Synod, they're a captive audience. So I will process out loud, and I will do it here. And I had a thought that is definitely going to come out that is going to make this video a little bit more spicy. Anyway, Generally speaking, the rest of the executive positions, everybody looks for the president who's going to be competent. There's someone who's demonstrated themselves, they've proven themselves, everybody knows their name, they've reached a certain point in the career, and that's who gets picked. And then the rest of the executive is sort of like, what are the other issues we have to fill out? When I talked about the fact that the Pope is American, which is really going to be a boon for fundraising for the Vatican that's in finance trouble, lots of people yelled Synod. But when you're electing positions like this, it's actually pretty important that there are a lot of things that you have to think about. So what has been happening at synods for the most part is, okay, who's the president? Well, you want that guy. And the president is often an older man with a Dutch name and a lot of institutional memory and a fair amount of visibility and a fair amount of demonstrated competence in the denomination that, broadly speaking, people would recognize because of sort of the way we do votes. Quickly, votes will cluster around someone, and then people scan the little bio and say, oh, he's done a lot. He's done this before. He did a good job. Boom, he goes in. And then the rest is like, okay, well, what else is important? Well, if the president is an American, let's get a Canadian in because you want to keep the Canadians happy because, I'm going to get in trouble. Because the Canadians sometimes complain that they're sort of the red-haired stepsister of the denomination. Nothing against gingers here, but the Canadians are sort of known for complaining that they're a minority in the denomination. All of the denomination energy is centered in the United States. I mean, it's just typical. America is huge. Canada is small. It's that sort of underclass concern. So, okay, the president's American. Let's maybe put in a Canadian. So you fill out the rest with a Canadian. And then, of course, well, what about ethnic diversity? Let's make sure that we affirm the Koreans and the African Americans and the Hispanics. So get a person of color in there. And then, well, since we've had women at Synod, well, get a woman up there. So if you look through the list, Scott Greenway, again, typical president. Jake Kuipers, I think he's Canadian, don't know, probably. Or one of those two guys are Canadian, almost certainly. And Jerome Burton's African-American pastor. All right. No woman that year. I'm sure that was talked about. 2015, Bruce Personaire. Now you'll notice Bruce Personaire, typical president. William Veenstra, Canadian, if I recall correctly, also longtime, well-known CRC minister. Bonnie Mulder, daughter of a very well-known, high-status Christian Reformed minister. Al Mulder went to the same church that I did in Grand Rapids. Again, notice the family thing. Christian Reformed Church is very family-oriented. I know Bonnie. I went to church with Bonnie. Bonnie serves in Classis Classis Greater Los Angeles in Southern California. Stanley Jim from Classis Red Mesa, Navajo. So that was a pretty typical slate. So you've got your president, is usually who the president is. You got a vice president, usually Canadian. You've got a woman, and you've got someone who doesn't have a Dutch last name. 2016, Paul DeVries, again, typical president. Jose Reyes, Classis Arizona, Hispanic. Fits that slot. Bert Slofstra, I suspect Canadian. And Elsa Fenema, a woman. 2017, Cor Poole, again, typical president. Thea Link, high-profile status pastor of Eastern Avenue. I think she's now retired. Long history of denominational participation. Rudy Gonzalez worked in race relations, pastors a church in Southern California, Hispanic. Ed Visser, Canadian. So, boom, there he goes. Another, was Cor Poole born in Canada? Might have been. The percentage of Christian Reformed ministers that Canada donates to the United States is far larger, and I think that the Canadian church produces more ministers per capita than the American church. So, maybe if I'll make up for some of the other things I said about Canada already, the Canadian church, in many ways, outperforms the American church in a lot of different metrics. They're a very important part of the Christian Reformed Church, even though sometimes they have a chip on their shoulder. Scott Greenway, again, typical president. Elizabeth Vanderhagen. Don't know who she is, but clearly a woman. Marilee Balmas, for sort of high profile, early woman to become a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, fairly well known. Cal Hogendorn. Canadian? My guess would be yes. Okay, so again, typical slate, but no non-Dutch last name. 2019, William Koopmans. Again, Thea Link. There she is again. Jose Reyes. There he is again. Melissa Van Dyke. There she is again. Did they have a Canadian? Is William Koopmans Canadian? He might be. It's sort of in the back of my mind. I don't know how. All those tags might not be right, but you sort of have that. You sort of have tags on people in terms of where they are. Then, of course, we had no two synods for COVID. And then we start to get a change. So Jose Reyes, Derek Bukema, Aaron Vriesman, Luann Sankey. That's when I knew, oh, interesting. All from Abide. 2022, 2023. Paul DeVries. So Paul not with Abide, but again, Paul had enough status that his election to the presidency, not surprising at all, sort of a typical president choice. Chad Steenwijk, Abide. Henry Cranenberg, Canadian, not Abide. Richard Bodini, Canadian, not Abide. 2024, Derek Bukema, Abide. Stephen Terpstra, Abide. Joshua Christoffels, Abide. Daniel DeGraff, Abide. This election, again, it was very interesting. It was too much to look up in the video. If you're super curious, you can look it up. So the first round of voting for the president was 59, 16, 13, 12, 11, and 10. And I bet almost anything Stephen Terpstra had the 59. Now, I'm not going to ask Nate. And I'm not saying it's rigged. I'm not saying that at all. But Abide has altered sort of the normal flow of the denomination. Just looking over Steve's bio, he, of course, served as Senate Vice President the year before. That certainly helps. I don't know that he's been a board president of anything. What's interesting is that in some ways, he's not old enough. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that there's a certain age, but again, this is where this reality of conservatism is never quite what you think. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk about centered set and bounded set. Because again, if you're a conservative, let's say if you're going to just continue to conserve the normal process by which Christian Reformed ministers are selected, well, the old system that gave us William Koopman, Scott Greenway, Cora Poole, Paul DeVries, Bruce Personaire, would pretty much say, well, most CRC Synod officers are going to probably be in their mid to late 50s. They've been board president of Home Missions, of Calvin Seminary, of Calvin University or College. They've got a resume that they've written things for the Banner. They've written a number of things for Today, the Family Altar. They've done all of these historical things in the Christian Reformed Church that would have sort of put their name up front so that synodical delegates, knowing almost nothing, would say, just like in almost every other election, oh, there's a name I recognize and I have a good association with that name. I'll vote for them. Historically, that's how Christian Reformed Church presidents have been selected. And what has happened is that, and part of this is the internet, of course, because you can't understand Abide without the internet. Because part of the way Abide was able to defeat the entrenched power system that had all the denominational tools was, in some ways, I think, analogous to the way that Donald Trump beat the Democratic Party not once but twice. In that Abide is sort of the organ of the new information economy. People aren't reading the Banner. In fact, many conservatives stopped reading the Banner a long time ago because the existing power group, there were tensions within it. And so again, my point isn't to say anything about Stephen or Derek. I think Stephen will do a great job. I think Derek Buchman did a great job. And they'll be competent. I have no problem there. And part of me is really happy that I don't have to do it. But what is important is to know how the internet is changing the Christian Reformed Church, how the information landscape is changing the Christian Reformed Church. I probably would not have been on the lists I have been on if it had not been blogging or my YouTube channel. So I should own that, because I haven't had the same career path as Scott Greenway or Bruce Personaire or Paul DeVries or Corpool or Williams Koopman. I've been pastoring a small, out-of-the-way, insignificant church in the denomination. Now, I do have a pretty good pedigree in terms of denominational service and classical service. I haven't had a big publishing presence in the Christian Reformed Church, and so I too, like Abide, have had most of my visibility through social media. And so again, my main point here is how the internet is transforming the landscape. And even if you say, well, I'm a conservative, there's nothing conservative about the ways that the internet is changing the Christian Reformed Church, or the broader church in North America for that matter. So the rest of the executives, since the liberationist boomers have been in charge, was something of a diversity virtue signal. Make sure you've got a woman. Make sure you've got a person of color. Make sure you've got a Canadian. Keep the identity factions happy. See, the exec says something about the culture of the body right there. Those days are gone. The Vibeshift is here. Now, if there's an email list about who to elect, I'm not on it. And not just the election list, but also not the, well, we're all going to agree to a vote for Stephen, or to vote for Derek, or to a vote for these people that are on the Abide list. I'm not saying such an email list exists. Such an email list doesn't have to exist to get this dynamic. So I'm not saying there's collusion. There might be. Because the liberationist boomers were also known to collude. They were just in a geographical area where they could do it fairly easily. And even guys on the list, like if you look at Scott Greenway, Corpool, Paul DeVries, Bruce Personaire, they're all moderates in the denomination. I could name some progressives. Thea Link, known progressive. But generally speaking, again, usually moderates got elected to the presidency. And Bruce is a fairly conservative guy, but generally speaking, Bruce is a moderate. But Scott, Bruce, Paul, Cor, William Koopmans, none of them abide. It's just not how they are. They're moderates. If I find out there is collusion, then I'll be more upset, because I don't think it's appropriate. But again, you don't really need it to get the kind of dynamics in voting that we're seeing. The CRC has always had a degree of factioning. The faction, as many do, had a geographic base, which is why everyone on the fringe would complain about Grand Rapids. Well, that faction is pretty clearly out, and there are new bosses in town. I call them the Abide Millennial Males, or the AMMs. Some of us know that the CRC has always had backrooms and backroom deals. We Democratic Anglos are always conflicted over this reality. Koreans, they're just upfront about it. If you work with the Koreans, you know, you go to the spa and you all get naked together. And that's where the deals are cooked. No women there, just the guys, just the head honchos, just the guys at the top of the hierarchy. That's where you make the deal. And then when you have the meeting, you come out and the cake is baked. You just present it to polite applause. Just a cultural difference. It's easiest to not make an ugly scene in public if your decisions are pre-cooked in private. If we do this the Korean way, the exile would have happened years ago. How much cooking is actually happening behind the scenes, I don't know, because I'm not in the inner ring. There's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on. Yeah, I mentioned someone on the... don't say the denomination was stolen. The denomination wasn't stolen. What happened in the denomination, just like the 2024 election wasn't stolen, the 2016 election wasn't stolen, and the 2020 election wasn't stolen either. These things happen in a body, and up they come. Yeah, I just lost 5 or 6 subscribers. There I go. What a stupid YouTuber. At least I don't think the 2020 election was stolen. Dum, dum, dum. But again, I'm not saying that this election is rigged. And I'm not even saying that there's necessarily collusion. I'm not saying there can't be. But I'm not saying there necessarily is, because you don't need it to get this kind of dynamic in the numbers. But again, it is a break, which is what's interesting. It is an example of how the internet is disrupting the Christian Reformed Church. Abide wasn't a secret cabal. Abide represented 70% of the Christian Reformed Church. No one stole anything. Abide was never a secret cabal, but that doesn't mean that leadership factions don't arise. They do, and they probably must. The millennials are, of course, the demographic cohort brought about by the baby boom. They used to be called the baby boom echo. Just as the baby boom became the boomers and seriously shaped the CRC over the last 70 years, it's now the millennials' turn to have their hand at the wheel. I've written plenty about how the baby boomers planted the seeds of their own demise. I'll spare you my thinking out loud. Now, Bruce Personaire is definitely a boomer, but Williams, Paul, myself, Scott, we're all in these born early 60s babies that are sort of this cusp, along with Jordan Peterson. A whole bunch of the IDW figures are right in that little cohort, the transition between the boomers and the Xers. So yeah, once again, Xers, sorry. If you're living in a democracy, you're just outvoted by the people a little bit older and the people a little bit younger. It's the way it is. More about my captive audience thing. I'll just read it anyway. I've written plenty about how the baby boomers planted the seeds of their own demise, so I'll spare you my thinking out loud. You're not a captive audience. You don't need to read this or anything else on Voices, unlike the unfortunate souls that will be sitting there more griping because it's painful. Maybe it was the boomers. Maybe it was the boomers mostly who needed to tell us how they felt at the mic, and the Abide millennial males usually like to bring. This is a new thing that I've seen. This again, I've been watching synods for a lot of years. The newest thing, and I think this is not just a point. This is a point about how the Christian Reformed Church is assimilating into evangelicalism. This is some of the point of the young, restless, and reformed energy that is coming into the Christian Reformed Church, because now, instead of people getting up to the mic and quoting Dooyeweerd or Kuyper or Bavinck or Kuyvenhoven or Burkhoff, now people are coming up with their Bibles and they're reading Bible verses to us. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with reading a Bible verse to synod. We've had devotions. We have devotions all the time. But it's really interesting because that is a change in culture again. And of course, the influence of the young, restless, and reformed movement on the Christian Reformed Church is another product of the internet. So I should have given a presidential campaign speech last night about my plan to limit, it cannot be ended, such synodical verbal diarrhea. And it doesn't involve a clock. And it might be thought of as unspiritual. But I would have called it merciful to those of us who will suffer, and suffer we will. Anyway, the Abide millennial men are in charge, and they seem to be more like the old Republican Party who took turns. Remember, it was Bob Dole's to be president. It was John McCain's. You know, they'd sort of take turns for the nomination. That's how the old Republican Party worked, and Donald Trump blew that away. And the Democrats decided they'd try their hand at it, and it was a really bad idea. People were really upset when Barack Obama jumped the line and became president instead of Hillary. So then, of course, the inevitability of Hillary And, of course, Donald beat Hillary. And then the Democratic Party, any reasonably honest party would never have run poor Joe Biden for a second term. There, I said that. Well, I'm going to mention Luann. Luann's wonderful. In case it was once again an abide, in this case, it was once again, in any case, it was once again an abide sweep. But we get to keep Luann at our table in Central California this time. We like that because Luann is wonderful. Luann is wonderful. She's from the Bay Area. I love Luann. At Synod 2022, when I sent out a tweet, it was the executive that Luann was on. Poor Luann was delegated to tell me to stifle. And poor Luann, she was so gracious and kind about it. I just had to give her a hug. And because Luann asked so sweetly, and because Synod said so, I submitted and I complied, and not another tweet was heard from again, nor was there a YouTube video. Well, we'll have a great time passing notes while the Bible is being read to us on the floor of Synod. It's a big book, although synodical speeches seldom cover it completely. The same texts tend to get read over and over again. I don't know if you've noticed that. I don't have any concerns that Synod will be competently run. Not at all. Joel Vander now is his new post, sort of, I don't know the title of his post, but D. Recker used to do it. And then another guy named Scott, who passed away tragically, did it, but he was quite competent. And Joel was the chair of the last advisory team. I think I was second reporter. So in case, there's always seconds to things, just in case you're pulled to another thing, there's a replacement. Being second reporter was nice because I didn't have to do anything. But Joel is super competent. I really like Joel. He was in Whitensville and got a chance to get to know him a little bit when I'd go to Whitensville. And again, there's familial and friends connection to him in the CRC. So I'm super happy Joel has that job, although his church in Whitensville, I'm sure, misses him terribly. And he was a great pick for that job. And so I'm not at all worried about the competence. The CRC is, generally speaking, a very competent denomination. We major in competence. We are industrious, cheerful, all the things that our youth paramilitary group drilled into us when we were young. So no questions on competence for these guys, and I do not begrudge them their time in the sun. But again, this is a sign of internet disruption in the Christian Reformed Church. And there are always externalities to these things. I'm not upset by the rise of the AMMs. Like the pastors of color at a certain race relations meeting in Southern California a few years ago. I've told this story before. We have this special race relations meeting in Southern California. A good number of Hispanic, African American, Korean, other Asian pastors were at the meeting, and someone brought up, how do you feel about the fact that it's usually the Dutch named older guys who are chairing your classes? And the guy said, we don't want to do it. We're happy they're there, and we'll rue the day that they all disappear because, as I said before, running a classis or a synod is a pretty thankless job. You'll get some applause, you'll get a little bit of status, you'll win the beauty contest more often if you do it, but there's no money involved. You lose all your free time, you get less sleep. If something happens, you get blamed. Even if you're not responsible, you get blamed by some jerk on the internet with a YouTube channel or a blog. So, because you can never talk about what goes on beyond the scenes because we're a competent denomination. We keep our mouths shut. Mostly. There's always leaky ships. So, I don't really mind someone else doing the kitchen work of keeping the machinery running. I love these mixed metaphors. A lot of ecclesiastical leadership is keeping the trains running, or at least the coffee breaks running on time. But I don't want voices to not notice that the Vibeshift is here. And again, it's another sign. Now I want to switch to a piece that I wrote. I got to find the article. Someone on Voices sent out a really fine article in Christianity Today called A Splintered Generation, by Skylar Flowers and Michael Graham. Evangelicals fracturing is chronic but not terminal. Here's how we can move forward. This is a little ambitious. It's a good article. I'll put the link below. one of the really it talks a lot about centered set and bounded set, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But one of the nice things it does is it takes Jake Meador's observations from Mere Orthodoxy. The fracturing of evangelicalism revealed that the historic bonds holding the movement together were less intellectual than they appeared, but were rather sociological, political, and cultural. Dividing lines lurked beneath the surface for some time, but in the wake of the series of flashpoints, the comfortable order of allegiances was disrupted, fractured by unspoken yet deeply held commitments. Now, that's true of the Christian Reformed Church. Again, the overall thing that is happening in the Christian Reformed Church has been its assimilation into the larger American Christian ecosystem. And until Synods 2022 to 2024, the division in the Christian Reformed Church of sort of the leadership and intelligentsia centered in Grand Rapids around the institution, which is typical for many Protestant denominations, even conservative Protestant denominations, was these were the leaders, and they're centered in sort of the central city of the denomination and the central institutions. They tended to be flowing mainline, but the rest of the body was flowing evangelical. And that's sort of like a 70-30 split. And as I said, in response to what Redeemed Zoomer said there, what's unusual about the Christian Reformed Church is because of our polity, and this is unlike the Reformed Church of America, where you had sort of the same distribution, but the leadership won and they maintained their power, and so 70% of the Reformed Church of America left the denomination. And the Christian Reformed Church, because of the particular way that our polity is different from that of the Reformed Church in America, even though there's a fair amount of commonality, the majority won. Our system is set up by a bunch of secessionists who want to keep their building, and they basically work by simple majority. I've made the comment before that. I remember not too many years after I got here, I was on a committee in my classes to rewrite the rules of classes because they need cleaning up. And I mentioned that one of our articles of classes, of the rules of classes, was that weighty, and these basically sort of echo the denominational church order, weighty matters should be decided by a 2/3 vote. A very common thing. Any rule of classical procedure can be set aside by a simple majority. And I said, you can set aside the 2/3 vote by the simple majority. And nobody cared. Why did nobody care? Because what the Christian Reformed Church tends to do is make the rules serve the will of the body. Now, that gets really tricky, like during the Women in Church Office Wars, when the split was like, 50-50. That's why those wars were so long, and why the now exiles anticipated that we're going to fight about this 20 years and then the church is going to have a local option, blah, 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 blah. It didn't happen. And I knew it wasn't going to happen because the church wasn't sitting still. And I've talked about the circulatory system. I've talked about why the deconstruction, the emergent movement of the children of the progressive wing, they've left the church. And the Christian Reformed Church has attracted people from the young, restless, and reform movement. And so the church has been getting more and more conservative. And because, again, Lyle Shaler's rule that, generally speaking, countercultural churches grow, and churches that are in alignment with the culture diminish. So these are 6 categories borrowed from the Mere Orthodoxy piece. Right-leaning evangelicals have left the church but identify as Christian or promote the merits of Christianity for preservation and conservative cultural values and institutions. These are sort of the utilitrads, as they're called. These are, and we've got plenty of them that we talk about in, so I was going to say in this corner of the internet, but I always get a comment, when you say this corner of the internet, what do you mean? I mean the ecosystem of channels, the flotilla, the conversation partners that I tend to have on YouTube. Not necessarily the people I'm making comments on videos about, but there's this whole community on YouTube that I participate in. So these are people, one might say that Jordan Peterson falls into this camp, although there's a whole group of people that used to be sort of classical liberals or even moderate left who have sort of swung to the right. Brett Weinstein, the whole IDW types. But neo-fundamentalists are, let's say, they don't bother going to church anymore, but if you ask them, they'll say nice things about Aaron McIntyre. Does he go to church? I don't know. Sargon of Akkad, another guy. I mean, maybe that they basically are, they want a Christian civilization, but they want enough people to go to church so that you have herd immunity to maintain whatever it is in the civilization that they want to preserve, but they don't actually practice. 2, mainstream evangelicals prioritize the Great Commission. So while they are concerned by extreme fundamentalism, they are more worried about the secular left's influence. This is a faction within the Christian Reformed Church that, again, basically what happened through much of the liberationist boomer regime of the late 20th and early 21st century up until COVID was that mainstream evangelicals, political moderates, let's say the pro-abortion Democrats, that'd be often the racial reconciliation faction. That was really the faction that I was a part of. These all tended to side with the hierarchy, with the liberationist boomers. And so that's why the conservatives were basically out of power for a number of generations in the Christian Reformed Church. They balanced out the church in a sense. They gave it some ballast because you had to worry about them as a group, but they never had enough votes at Synod to sort of get their way. You know, again, women in church office was such an important thing in the 1990s when that all went through. And that was also the point at which the Christian Reformed Church was at its numeric peak. But there were sort of seeker evangelicals who, often boomers, Willow Creek, Billy Graham. Christian Reformed Church was, right in line in that sense with Christianity Today. And the banner was sort of like a particularized Christianity Today. And they sort of tracked. And of course, I just made a video about that has Tim Keller and Caitlin Beatty and Glenn Scrivener and Wes Huff and Michael Horton and Skye Jitani on the cover, on the thumbnail of that video. So the mainstream evangelicals, and of course the mainstream evangelicals have been fractured now. Neo-evangelicals emphasize the global nature of the movement and the need to engage with the culture. This group critiqued conservative political allegiances and failures on social issues while addressing liberal Christianity's theological compromises. That's exactly where the Holy Post is located, right there. Okay? And so you have the splitting of the mainstream evangelicals, really sort of a generational cohort. The boomers sort of stayed mainstream evangelical, but the Xers and the millennials, many of them sort of begin, usually under the influence of the emerging church movement, sort of begin to wander to the left. And so they're calling, I don't like the nomenclature. Neo-evangelicals is technically all of them. I call them the progressive evangelicals usually. Post-evangelicals centers on justice and accountability. They challenge hypocrisy and abuses in the church while distancing themselves from evangelical identity, although they hold to core doctrinal beliefs. Okay, that's sort of the Holy Post too, but I would argue that, they're going to get to the ex-evangelicals. So, I don't know, is that enough distinction in there? Should we have 4 categories or 5 instead of 6? Left-leaning ex-evangelicals have de-churched due to the disenfranchisement with evangelicalism's failure, but retain some Orthodox Christian beliefs. And then the de-churched have left both the church and the Christian faith entirely, abandoning all vestiges of belief. And again, is belief the right word? That, of course, is changing too with the liberal, post-liberal conversations. So that's the article I'm referring to in what I'm about to write, and what I wrote and what I'm about to read. Excellent article. My only quibble is that the centered set versus bounded set never pans out as well as those who push it usually hope. Centered set people can only orient by bounded set fence posts. Bounded set people usually unwittingly move their fence posts. Again, my point about conservatism and an internet disruption in the denomination of sort of having new implicit rules about who should be president of Synod. It's a great example of a fence post that's been moved, but conservatives aren't paying attention, don't have relevance realization with that particular fence post. So a conservative might say, hey, you've changed who serves as president of Synod. No, we haven't. The rules stay the same. Okay. but the tradition has changed. Let's be clear. They look at certain fence posts and don't see other ones because they are theoretically innumerable fence posts to judge by, etc. Having said that, the rest of the analysis is helpful of that article that I just read. While it is true that one way to understand the widening gulf between Grand Rapids East exiles, former heads of the institutional denomination, and the 70% of the church that exiled them, is who they were listening to. That was brought in a discussion. It was like, well, these people are listening to other people. In other words, as the Christian Reformed Church is being assimilated into the larger Protestant ecosystem, really metagelical ecosystem in the United States, James Scott wrote about this in his 150th anniversary piece at Dort's magazine, at Dort's journal, where he basically said, CRC doesn't control its own weather. The CRC is... Everyone in the CRC is reading now. We're no longer reading theologians out of the Netherlands. That stopped in the 70s, or diminished in the 70s. Now we're reading other American theologians. Now we are in tune with the larger ecosystem in the United States. Now Tim Keller and John Piper and Nadia Bolz-Weber have more influence than the Banner editor. That again, another change. And again, conservatives, well, a true conservative would only read the Banner, forsake all other magazines. Yeah, but then, or maybe only Outlook, or only Christian Renewal, or now only what Abide does on their website. I only read Abide. No, people are reading. And people are reading Puritan divines, and people are reading all sorts of things. And so that way, in some ways, the broader culture war issues have more and more weight inside the denomination. It's important to ask the question, why did the former head of the denomination, the head that the rest of the body chopped off, why did the former head of the listen to Group X, and what happened to that 70% mix pointed them to follow or listen other broader cultural and Christian leaders beyond it? It's an important question to fully answer, but there are probably a variety of partial answers out there that are good enough for this post. I still think that part of the answer is connected with, now David Snapper on Voices has a thesis. Years ago, he wrote a THM thesis while he was at Calvin Seminary that basically noted that in church planting, churches that are planted within an existing population of 2,000 plus Christian Reformed people within a certain radius with their institutions hit that magic 200 level within 2 years and then go on to be flourishing Christian Reformed churches. David Snapper noted that in the vast majority of cases, the Christian Reformed Church was unsuccessful in hitting that mark in places that the Christian Reformed Church tried to plant churches outside of areas where it had a significant population. Those churches stayed small and didn't live that long, a failure to thrive. There are a few outliers, like my friend Kevin Adams. A few exceptional Christian Reformed ministers managed to do it. And we'll have to see yet if Christ Church Davis and Eric Dirksen and Aaliyah will manage to break that curve. But it's a pretty tough thing to break. It's pretty durable. And this was during the time when what was happening in seeker church methodology and church planting methodology is that you would look across the United States at places where there was fast growing communities, and that was the metric that you chose. And so the CRC jumped on that bandwagon and spent a lot of money trying to plant churches in places where there were no Christian Reformed churches. And Snapper's thesis pretty much held. Dave's been on the channel too. He was one very early guest. I think part of the answer is connected to the Snapper thesis, just with a different application. Grand Rapids East, as the mother of all clusters, was likely able to retain cultural segment of the church that no other cluster could fully maintain, just like they could enfold others in their orbit in ways that smaller clusters could never, as seen in the ability to and inability to plant a certain size of church plant. In other words, what I'm saying, when you look at Snapper's thesis, he said, the thicker the Christian Reformed church population in the area, the more likely a church plant will grow. And that's been proven out in the ground. It's pretty easy to plant a CRC in the Grand Rapids area because it will flourish, and it won't just flourish by CRC transfers. You will attract other non-churched and non-CRC people into your church plant. And those church plants, if done well, have a good chance of growing. But the Grand Rapids area is unlike every other area in the Christian Reformed Church. It is so much deeper. It is the center of the denomination. And as the denomination, and so everything, all the rules of the denomination are different in Grand Rapids. Sometimes they're intensified. Sometimes they can just simply be broken because the dynamics are that different. But when it came to the PSI, that was same-sex marriage, running through the churches of North America, the cut was revealing. The PSI cut differently in different places, but it developed the coalition that resulted in the current exile. Countercultural clusters were hardened to exile Christian Grand Rapids East. What do I mean by that? The loyal opposition, the conservatives, the confessionalists, they had been slowly gaining power. And over the last 30 years of synods, you can watch that power grow. More and more irritation with the banner, who seemed to be pointing at issues that the conservatives found annoying and irritating and suspicious. More shots fired at the banner editor. More shots fired at the Office of Social Justice. Just more complaining about Grand Rapids. More churches, of course, they had the Women in Church office fight. More churches sort of leaking. First Ripon left the denomination, has become PCA. More and more of that going on, and you could just watch their power grow slowly as more and more people in the middle begin siding with them on more and more votes at Synod. And so when this sigh of same-sex marriage finally really hits the Christian Reformed Church, well, that counterculture is big and brawny and organized and ready to go. So even though Abide itself was sort of this coalition, the leadership of Abide, I think, mostly confessionalist. And correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty conservative sort of politically, socially, and confessionalist. So when it hits, they're ready to take leadership. They could accomplish something like the discipline that they had been naturally wanting to accomplish over years of frustration. What do I mean by that? Well, overtures to Synod right now are about, you need to retool the banner. That's been a big issue for them for a long time. It'll probably go through. I don't know. We'll see. When the axe fell, and it happened in 2022, 2023, 2024, it was sort of a question, well, I knew they would be willing to discipline, but how fast would it go? Well, they were ready. And they had the votes, and there was clarity. I hear all the Roman Catholics talking about, what we want from the Pope is clarity. Well, the Christian Reformed Church got clarity. And what happened is that a whole bunch of annoyances that were happening before are not about to happen. You are not going to see the kinds of articles from the banner or on the website of the Office of Social Justice. You're not going to see a whole bunch of things that I would read a lot of complaints about on CRC Voices. You are not going to see those kinds of things probably ever again in the Christian Reformed Church. It's not going to happen. That doesn't mean there won't be annoyances. But that type of annoyance, it's done. The sigh has cut through. The head is chopped off. It's clarity. That's exactly what many in Abide, not all, but many in Abide were looking for. And, you know, it's some of the same energy in terms of the Trump administration and the first 100 days. Now, how that will go has yet to be seen. Both the United States budget and the Christian Reformed Church do have some really inconvenient truths that they are facing. And once you sort of gain leadership over it, it does become your problem. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The Vibeshift happened, and the reckoning that they had long fantasized about could take place. And it has. And it will be completed. There's really no question about that. The post-culture war blue state clusters like Sacramento had long ago had the Psi go through us. And this was why had Psi go through us. So many of the exiling had already happened at the local level. So the former leadership didn't have the allies they assumed they would have to stand up to the confessionalists. There was a post-something type of confessionalism, we don't have the names for it, that had sufficient alignment with the old school confessionalists that resulted in the exiling now taking place. In other words, in places like Sacramento and places like Los Angeles and places like the Bay Area, in places all over the United States of deep blue states that people would think, yeah, these were, you could pull on the alliance in the Women in Church office. This is what I talked about in terms of the circulatory system, in terms of the Christian Reformed church getting more and more conservative. There's a world of difference between 1990 and 2020. It's 30 years, but it was a world of difference in terms of what many of those churches, I've talked about this quite a bit, in the world-class cities of North America, Toronto, the dynamics are different. The Psi went through these places far earlier, and the churches that have survived have adapted. And so everyone expected that, well, San Francisco and Los Angeles and New Jersey and Chicago, and that we would have been like the Rohirrim riding to Grand Rapids and to Synod and stopping those evil confessionalists. And Grand Rapids looks around and it's like, and we're like, we all have to sort of vote our convictions. Really, we do. And then when the votes were counted at Synod, of course, the exiles were just in shock because it was like the Rohirrim rode in and sided with the orcs. At least that's how it looked to them. The depth of the deepest pond that is Grand Rapids is ironically what doomed them. Fringe areas that had already experienced the harrowing or the pre-harrowing in the case of church plants. I remember when one woman came out, I think she was from the RCA, and I was working in this project between the CRC and the RCA, and she came out and discovered all of the conservative church plants in the RCA out here, most of whom are no longer RCA. And CRC people, after fighting the Women in Church office wars, would go to church plants and say, these church plants are complementarian. These church plants are male only in terms of leadership. And I said, yeah, they're conservative. That's who's growing. Those are the churches that are succeeding. And they just, as a cow stares at a new gate. It just couldn't understand it. And I'd say, the world is different here than it is in the deepest pond that you're swimming in, okay? And I'd been telling people that for years. This is not happening. The future is not unfolding like you think it will. History has not ended. But you can only see what you can see. The write-downs had taken place, but because of where the CRC was at, in the depths of its circulatory system, Grand Rapids neither had that experience nor could understand it sufficiently to bear those costs politically now. The best example of this is the RCA that has already had a different makeup. While I understand the expedience of jumping to the RCA, which is what a lot of clergy are doing because they can sort of do that in terms of church order until this synod probably shuts that door. While I understand the expediency of jumping into the RCA for the ministerial class in terms of long-term church strategy, it's sort of like hopping into a 1973 V8 wagon thinking it's a great vehicle for the future. Now the 1970s are here, and they want the Ford wagon back with the woody trim. You know what I'm talking about? Looking at the shape of that first cut votes at Synod officers again, and the fact that Synod is looking very white male-ish, I know that sounds woke on my part, but I'd see it as a demographic way, not in a justice way, or a Bide-ish. It makes the posties nervous. The post-liberals, those of us who have already had the Psy go through us, a decade or so ago, but still have women elders, women ministers. We're sort of in the middle here, and we look at the conservative wins, and it's like, are they going to come after us next? And of course, all the exiles are saying, yes, we told you they would. They didn't listen. Your doom comes next. Well, maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Because the thing is, most of the women in ministry in a place like California, most of them, they're conservative too. I remember going to the congregational meeting at First Ripon when they were leaving the denomination. And it was the women at the church that were demanding that they leave. It was the women. And again, this is so counter-narrative to the liberationist boomers. They can't understand, how are these women so conservative? They just are. But again, back to the point about conservatism isn't quite what you think. Those churches aren't about to take the congregational vote away from the women. And if you remember Fancy Nancy before she passed away on the Freddie and Paul show, when she was growing up, women did not vote in First Ripon at all. Is First Ripon going to take away the congregational vote from the women? I don't think so. And I still don't think the Christian Reformed Church is going to switch on complementarianism, at least anytime soon. That would then, once you now have power, suddenly you have to worry about ruling. And so, the Christian Reformed Church might lose 30 to 40 churches, might lose 20, 30, 35,000 people in this split left. But if the Abide millennial men sort of go after women in church office, I don't know that they have the votes, because then suddenly you reset up some dynamics, which is exactly what your revolution was designed to end. So power has its responsibilities. Yes, we heard and understood the warning of the 15% who are now leaving. But we also had to stand by our convictions. Class of Central California this year has one guy, me, and 3 women delegates. It wasn't a justice move by Classis. We're posties. We're sort of post the Psy. It's just how it turned out. Even though we as a Classis do have a contingent of vocal complementarians and Abide millennial men in our Classis. We have them too, and they're friends of mine. And some of them are on that list, and some of them made a big splash at last year's Synod. You know who I'm talking about. It was just how it turned out. Of course, we are nervous, but being groups that have long been on the fringe and already long suffered the negative impacts of the death of the circulatory system, our culture war markdowns have already been calculated. If there comes a point where we need other options in terms of a larger body, we'll probably be more creative than Grand Rapids. And again, when I saw this coming, I was really talking to my friends and say, don't just dump to the RCA. That's a bad move. Do something creative. Now that you have the opportunity to think about broader church bodies in a Protestant world, there's actually been some interesting things that have been done in that. For example, Echo in the Presbyterian Church. Think creatively about what denominations in the 21st century really look like, and start building something like that. They're just jumping for the RCA now. Maybe that will happen. I don't know. The difficulty is, if once they formally join the RCA, it's pretty easy to get in. It won't be easy to get back out again, because all the churches that left the RCA, and it seems now the Alliance of Reformed Churches that started, that became sort of a landing pad, because you weren't allowed to leave the RCA with your building unless you went to another denomination. So a classmate of mine and another RCA pastor that I knew quick started that quickie denomination. It's like, we're going to start an S Corp real quick a minute. Boom. And like all these churches jumped into it. But that seems to be leaking now. And so the Christian Reformed Church, you don't need anything special to leave with your building as long as you have a solid majority in your local church. But you don't need to join anything right away either. And I was really hoping, because you got a ton of really competent, really experienced, really smart leaders in that exile group. And it's like, now, I'm not exiling, but part of me just like is a little thinking, boy, that'd be kind of fun. I know some of you Catholics and Orthodox are just cringing at this point, but to start a denomination from a blank sheet, fresh, that sounds kind of cool. I'm not leaving the Christian Reformed Church. I don't need to. Confessionally, I think I'm right in there. I'm not being pushed out. But to start something new, I like that kind of creative thing. That would be exciting. But I understand that group is in shock. They are licking their wounds. They are, and I think the Rhesus money with sort of the wired little monkey with the head on it that they cling to with the towel. I think that's the RCA. Oh boy. No, with all due respect, RCA. See, this is why it's unwise to do what I'm doing if you intend to have a career. Because I make videos like this, a whole bunch of people are thinking, he'll never be president of Synod. And my mom says, yes! I like to speak my mind. All right, where are we? It was just how it turned out, even though we as a classist do have a contingent of complementarians. Oh, I already read that. Many of us were hoping the exiles would do something less conventional, but early indications weren't good. It's not the fault of the individuals per se, maybe lack of leadership at Snap are always notes, but the fact that in West Michigan, your dynamics simply are different. We are reading and following different people. Partly because we have to. We're in different contexts, and the context isn't not, the Christian Reformed Church in some ways was a sufficient size and sufficiently distinct from the general population of Grand Rapids that it had a bigger influence on Grand Rapids itself. Now Grand Rapids is just the second largest city in Michigan. And so the Christian Reformed Church is alike enough with all the other. Now, Grand Rapids has a lot of churches. I had my conversation with Kent Dobson. But the system has changed. Our margins are so thin, meaning out here in the Sacramento cluster. I mean, these exiles are our friends. And so that's why this is so, I don't want to lose my friends. Our margins are so thin, we really don't have a lot of extra resources to help Grand Rapids figure out not just the options on the next denominational menu, but rather to see beyond how the disruption of what the disruption of denomination means. You've been the long beneficiaries of the circulatory system, and now, unfortunately, you have to pay some of those costs of the benefits, but you got to pay them. It's just part of the deal. You got all of those boomers flooding in from the fringes, boomers who went out for jobs in the Bay Area and Los Angeles and Portland and Seattle and Toronto and Chicago and North Jersey and Washington and all of these cities. You went out early in your life and you had careers out there and you helped found all these fringe Christian Reformed churches. And now as those churches are slowly dying and or becoming more conservative, You retire in the Grand Rapids area or on the coast of Lake Michigan, and the house you sold in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles, boy, you can buy a really nice house in Grand Haven today. You really can. You can buy a nice lake house on Lake Michigan. You can buy a beautiful palace in the suburbs of Grand Rapids. And there's a host of Christian Reformed churches, all with a little elements of exactly what you're looking for, because of course there's a menu of diversity among Christian Reformed churches, even of the exiles who are going out. They're not all the same by any means. And you move back to Grand Rapids and you have all of that choice, and you have so many family members that are there because you all intermarried at the spawning grounds of Calvin College, and it was a wonderful choice to make. But you became trapped, captive to your own people group. And just like the Dutchmen who left the Netherlands in the 19th century, or even just after the Second World War, the Netherlands kept changing. And all of us out here on the fringe have kept changing, and we've had to adapt to all of the struggles that we have. And so now it's Grand Rapids' turn to feel the pain. But their churches were different. They've got a stronger, younger cohort. And so I'm super interested to see, okay, you're leaving the denomination. What are you going to be able to do missionally? You're free of the baggage of the conservatives. You no longer have to look over your right shoulder. What are you going to do? You're just going to go join the RCA and have business as usual? It's a waste of a crisis. Should think outside the box. And just adding churches from around the world and endorsing the fiction of having them be members of your classis, no, that's not it. You've got a lot of smart people and a lot of good mission heads and a lot of good hearts. I would love to see that group of exiles do something amazing. Prove your convictions on the difficult issue of same-sex marriage. Demonstrate how you're not going to go into the dead end of the main line. Prove everyone wrong. I'd love nothing more than to see it. But if you're just going to join the RCA and keep doing what you've already done, that sigh comes for you. It'll just keep coming. Snapper is right in that the future is more face-to-face and local regional in terms of the adaptive structures rather than the binational. Who's calling me? Freddie. I just talked to Freddie. When institutions collapse because of the lack of trust, the relationality gets much more personal and local. The digital is increasingly forcing a new medieval feudal. Maybe the post-CRC exile voices is the new Latin, because there's concern when the exiles leave. A lot of them are on Voices, and a lot of them stayed on Voices after the Women in Church Office Wars. And in that sense, they inherited Voices. And now, are they going to stick with our little listserv? I hope so, because they're my friends. I want to keep hearing from them. And I want to hear how their experiment goes. And I want them to do some cool things. And that's what I want to see them do. Maybe the post-CRC exile voices, CRC Voices, is the new Latin. The language that allows the priestly class to transcend the vernacular. And Snapper wrote a lovely follow-through to that on Voices, but you'd have to actually join Voices to read it. It's not on the open internet. And I'll just warn you that CRC Voices is like a fire hose. And people who get on it often get off it quickly, because it's like, I wanted a little peek into the Christian Reformed Church. I didn't want the fire hose. Well, it's a fire hose. And so far, we don't have our own little AA bot to summarize this email. Probably won't make any sense. Why so many of you like CRC Inside Baseball? I don't know. But I just gave you a big, steaming, healthy slab of it. And, of course, I can't do this during Synod itself. I don't know that I'll do another video about Synod before Synod. I will more than likely do videos after Synod about Synod. But, yeah, there it is. You see why I'll never be president of Synod? This is why. Probably why I should never be president of Synod. So, there we have it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.